Hello and welcome. I'm Ashwin Mohan and you're watching The Law Street presented by Legal League Consulting in association with ET Now. In today's episode, we will talk about the ease of doing business in India and how a host of economic reforms and liberal fiscal policies by the government have given a boost to the investment climate in the country. To discuss the recent policy measures and initiatives and deliberate on the issues and challenges going ahead while doing business in India, we are joined today by a team of legal experts. H Sharma, partner and chairperson of Global India Practice, DLA Piper; Saket Shukla, founding partner of Phoenix Legal; Manoj Kumar, founder of Hammurabi Solomon; and Rashi Dhir, senior partner of DMD Advocates. Gentlemen, thank you so much for taking out time and joining me for today's discussion. Saket, let's kickstart today's discussion with you. You've been very closely following the entire FDI regime of the government. How do you see the investment curve shaping up?
I think the signs are all very positive. There is investor confidence that has been restored. The macroeconomic indicators also are looking positive, although you had a bit of a slump in the industrial production recently. But that aside, all indicators point to a vibrant investment climate being created. It's a slow process. I don't think we're going to see results as quickly as people would want them to be. It's maybe a 2 to 3 year process that will be needed further down the lane. Some of the initiatives have been pretty good. Investors are looking at the sectors closely. There are new sectors which are being opened up. The new opportunities in India. M&A seems to be on the rise. There are new initiatives being taken which prompt, which promote growth. Things like insolvencies being looked at. A new insolvency regime is
a real estate regulator.
Real estate regulator, right? And the competition process, competition law is recent. Things are more standardized now. People know what to expect, what can happen, what should happen. So there's greater clarity, which effectively boosts investor confidence. But I guess it's this. To my mind, it's not the time where you sit back and pat yourself on the back. This is really the time that we need to get going. There are a lot of steps that need to be taken. Center is taking some of these steps. States have to come in together. GST, again, a brilliant initiative. It's very nice to see all political parties come together and change the law to pave way for a new tax regime, which should hopefully be beneficial to the country.
So your point being that the stage is clearly set.
The stage is set,
all
absolutely.
Right, so I'll quickly get in Manoj as well before I get on to a few specific questions with Daniel and Rashi. Manoj, would you like to add to what Saket has just shared?
Yeah, I think the approach has to be to make the entire ecosystem as an enabler, when we're talking about ease to do business. And apart from the reforms, sectoral reforms that we referred all this while, real estate, bankruptcy, etc., I think the right ecosystem has to be that we need to provide these services in a seamless manner to the entrepreneurs and investors who come to do business in India. I think that's a very important key. Because the fine line between decisions of investing in India, walking that final line, crossing that line or not doing it, is impacted by the perception. 2015 report of the World Bank, out of 189 countries, India is 130 on ease to do business. That doesn't speak too well. And if we just move on one more parameter, enforcement of contracts, we actually 178 or 179 out of 189. So there is a lot of work to be done on the legal and enforcement ecosystem to improve the ease to do business. I think that's where there's a lot of work ongoing by the government. We'll of course touch on some of them as we go along, and that could probably impact a lot more on the investments and the M&A side.
Manoj, you spoke about enforcement of contracts, and that's where I want to get in Daniel. Daniel, timely enforcement of contracts, or perhaps the lack of it, can make or break a deal. This really affects business on a day-to-day basis. We've recently had amendments to the Arbitration and Conciliation Act. Do you think it will reduce the burden on the court system?
I do think that it can be a success, and that's really a reform that international clients have been waiting for a long time. Because there were issues in international arbitrations that got blocked by interim injunctions by Indian courts, for example. And if an investor looks at different destinations for an investment, enforcement of contracts, of course, does play an important role there. So we do hope that the arbitration ordinance will improve the situation. We do believe that it will. There are regulations in it about, very progressive regulations, like rendering an arbitral award within 12 months, in principle at least. That's something you don't often see in international arbitrations outside India. So if that can happen, if it works out, I think it's a big advantage for India as an investment destination. Now, apart from the Arbitration Act, of course, there's also the Commercial Courts Ordinance that has been adopted, which we believe will be an important impetus also for international investors. I've seen so many clients, international companies, that have been stuck in high courts or even lower courts in India for many years. And that's sometimes quite frustrating, as it is for Indian claimants or plaintiffs as well.
Yeah, it cuts both ways, yeah.
Yes. And I do think that the recent reforms in that area will help.
All right. Rashi, now you've heard the preliminary comments from the rest of the panel. I'm going to pose the tax question to you. One issue that really sticks out like a sore thumb is the retrospective amendments to tax laws. They've still not been made prospective. Of course, a lot of great work has been done on the tax front. There's been a lot of ease that has been introduced in tax administration reforms. Of course, the big bang GST has also now got the go-ahead. But the one example which really, in fact, gave a lot of unwarranted or unnecessary publicity to the aggression of the Indian Tax Department was, in fact, the Vodafone case and the retrospective amendments. They've still not been totally given a burial. What's your take on that front?
I think the one key aspect of all of the reforms and the focal point for the government ought to be the certainty and transparency. What retroactive amendment did was really, we were proud of, and many of the foreign investments were quite reliant on the rule of law, which also goes to the enforcement of contract. And all of a sudden, that was a complete shift in stance when the retroactive amendment came, because that creates a huge amount of uncertainty. There is, irrespective of what the valuations may be, irrespective of what reforms you may bring under FDI, the key question is, what is the return on investment? And if you can't get any certainty or transparency on that, it will not work. Retroactive amendment has been in some ways a sore point.
Rashi, if I can just interrupt you over there, the government has seen two budgets. And in both these budgets, investors have hoped that these retrospective amendments to tax laws would be overturned or would be made prospective. In some sense, many feel that the government's playing it a little too safe. Do you concur? Or do you think the government should ideally wait for the courts to pass a verdict in this case, rather than bring about a change in the existing tax policy?
Yeah, so I think my view is that the government ought to play safe here, because one of the things with the retroactive amendment, one of the claims is that the government has in fact, in some ways, turned the law of the land, which is the courts have interpreted, particularly in the Vodafone case, it came out to be in favor of Vodafone, and we found that there was legislation which was retroactively amended. And so the government, if it flips very quickly, is concerned that it has to go through the process of law. And it has come up with certain mechanisms to solve the problem in terms of, having introduced the high-powered committee so that they are able to get rid of any frivolous sort of demands that are being made by the assessing officers. They have created a high-powered committee for purposes of creating a filter. The committee consists of 4 members of CBDT to who the AO is supposed to refer to all cases that are prior to 2012 related to retroactive amendment. And the committee is the one who then decides to move forward with the case or not. By and large, the government is keeping with the process of law, and I think that is the right stance. Because if they were to quickly, it's not within their power as an executive to make that decision, and they have to bring it to the legislature.
On that note, we'll have to slip into a short break. Keep watching ET Now and The Law Street. Our discussion on ease of doing business with our esteemed legal panelists continues on the other side. Welcome back to the Law Street. We continue our discussion on ease of doing business with our legal experts. Now let's move onwards to Companies Act, which is also a very significant piece of legislation. And in fact, one of the main motives of the Modi government has been to keep the domestic laws in sync with international best practices. Right. Saket, how do you look at the Companies Act? What are some of the main features that will perhaps aid corporates in terms of ease of doing business in India?
Quite a few. I mean, the Companies Act has brought in quite a few changes. Private companies can now have up to 100 members. There's a concept of women directors that has been introduced. There's an obligation in terms of social responsibility, corporate social responsibility, which I think is a very, very good initiative. Shareholders have been empowered more. Managerial remuneration, for instance, instead of going to the government, goes to the shareholders now. These are all very positive steps. They introduced National Company Law Tribunal with time-bound resolution of issues. Again, extremely positive.
Even liability of auditors and independent directors. That's an important point. Yeah.
Auditors is a pretty important one, especially because that's part of your class action suits. They can be gone after. But interestingly and very importantly, there's a conflict rules that have been brought in. So which again goes on to show that if you have an auditor, they can't be providing services to the same company for while being an auditor, and there are time periods within which they'll have to be necessarily rotated out. Now, all these are brilliant initiatives, but I think the issue remains, and that's what the government needs to really think of, is are you really simplifying the law? Probably not. I mean, what have you done? You had a 600 odd section Companies Act of 1956 that's been replaced with purportedly a smaller set of regulations under the Companies Act, but there are a bunch of rules that have been prescribed. The reason is that it just complicates the whole process.
Daniel, since we are talking about ease of doing business in India, let's also try and get a sense of how India fares when you compare it to its main Asian rival, and that's China. What's your take?
Well, comparing India and China always is difficult, of course, because they're so different cultures, histories, governing schemes, of course.
Are there any lessons in China that perhaps the Indian government can learn from?
And each of the countries has the opportunity to improve and the need to improve. In view of India, I would say infrastructure is, of course, the main issue to be resolved or to be worked on, at least in the short to medium term. India can also tap into its human capital more effectively, I do believe. And if you look at the Skill India initiative, I think that it's a brilliant initiative. Educating 300 million young people, 300 million by 2025. 2022, I believe, is a great program, and that will help India a lot. Also to catch up with its rivals at the international scene. And if some of the reforms, if 50% of the reforms that are envisaged in India will be implemented, then I cannot see any reason why India should not match up with China as well at the economic level.
All right. Manoj, opening up of the legal sector by the Bar Council of India. Now, that's an interesting topic that will get smiles on the faces of all the panelists. How do you see that in terms of the whole theme of ease of doing business in India? Clearly, it's going to lead to a situation where there's going to be greater competition. It will also lead to a lot of churn in the domestic law firm industry. What's your take?
Well, this issue has been in discussion for more than 2 decades now. In fact, we've just submitted this report to the Government of India. It's like an elephant in a dark room, and everybody is imagining, as you said, that there will be a lot of churning amongst the law firms. Somebody is saying there will be a lot of talent pool shake-up going to happen. There's a lot of revenue shake-up. So it's like everybody is imagining how it will take shape. I think it's important to notice what is driving the process now with the present government based on what we see. We have a draft rules which have been brought out by the Bar Council of India for entry of foreign law firms, for permitting them to practice in India. And the entire backdrop and focus of the draft rule appears to be to simplify ease of doing business. I think for the first time there's a shift to actually make any kind of a policy reform on this issue as an enabler to ease of doing business. And that's a big change, and that people have to see it's written on the wall very clearly.
All right.
So based on that, the Bar Council has recommended that they should be permitted to do practice on international law, for foreign law, which Indian lawyers cannot do, international arbitration, which is already permitted pursuant to a Supreme Court order in an ongoing matter, and non-litigious work, which is in the cross-border nature. So these three are supposed to be permitted shortly, and we are trying to also assist the government as a firm, as Hammurabi and Solomon, to try and be an enabler so that this can happen sooner than later.
So clearly exciting days ahead, and who knows, perhaps there might be consolidation in the Indian law firm space in anticipation of some of the foreign firms entering the market. In fact, I quickly want to get in Rashi over here. Rashi, if you look at the entire startup focus of the Modi government, there's been a surge in the interest as far as startups are concerned. Some of these startups are commanding astounding valuations, in some cases perhaps even more than some of their listed peers. In the recent past, there's been a blip of sorts because investors are getting increasingly restless. But on the tax front, what's your take on some of the tax incentives that the Modi government has provided to startups to give them an overall boost?
Yeah. So just taking the cue from Manoj, I think the whole idea of the government appears to be what can they do to solve some of and be an enabler in solving some of the problems. And I think startup features as an incredible opportunity. In some ways, the government realizes that India, to solve the problems, there has to be innovation. And I think that is the driver of this whole startup scheme, if you would. The government is absolutely right on this front because it takes care of two things. It takes care of certainly innovation and particularly technology innovation as being a possible solution to some of the problems of India. The government is actually, in order to promote, have come up with certain incentive plans, and I think there'll be more that will be happening. But the two main features of the startup incentive plan is the tax holiday that the government is offering to the startups, which is a 3-year tax holiday. And I think that's an important one because, as you can imagine, initially startups are crunched for money, and every penny that comes in, they would like to keep within the system as opposed to allow it to leak out of the system. And as long as they're spending the money towards creating innovative product, the government is in some ways promoting the idea. And then the second, actually a very interesting a concept, which is not so much just the startup, but overall from an innovation perspective, the government has introduced something called the limited patent box regime, which sounds very interesting to me. It's something that actually has been done in other countries like France, where the government is suggesting that if you develop a patent in India, there will be a preferential treatment given to you.
On that note, I'll have to quickly get in Daniel over here. Daniel, you've been an advisor to several multinational corporations over the years. What are some of the main aspects where you would expect to see changes? Could you list out your top 3?
Yeah, the top 3. I think infrastructure is a recurring scheme and topic. Clients, in particular in the manufacturing field, do need reliable power supply. They do need good roads. They do need good transport opportunities. So that's really something the government needs to work on. Secondly, education of young people, of the workforce, will be very helpful to the country and then also to the foreign investors, of course. It's an important criterion. And thirdly, I would say in terms of tax laws, predictability is another key thing that the government needs to tackle and needs to ensure.
On the FDI front, are there any more sectors that perhaps need to be opened up? Of course, the government always has this concern about opening up sensitive sectors. How do you think they have gone about the entire FDI regime? Because today, many ministers in the Modi government proudly say that India is perhaps the most open destination in terms of investments in the world.
Yep, probably, and I think on particularly sector-wise, I don't think there are many that now need consideration. One of the areas where, I mean, personally, I think they could have done something else rather than the way they did it, which was on insurance. They increased it to 49, but the way in which control, Indian owned and controlled, has been defined leaves some doubt as to whether you are better off as a 26% shareholder particularly the kind of rights that as a foreign investor you reserved as a 26% shareholder, than becoming a 49%. So I guess fine-tuning some of the sectors that have already been opened up, regulations around those, would be a good idea. From purely an FDI perspective, I think most sectors that are covered, and sensitive sectors, of course, the government has to be protective and has to be intelligent about how they open up some of these sectors.
All right, Manoj, it's time now for closing comments. Would you like to highlight some of your major solutions as far as creating a better atmosphere is concerned? If you could just highlight your top 3 and summarize some of your major concerns.
Yes, so I personally see a gap between the reforms on the structural reforms in terms of fast-track commercial courts, or similarly reforms on the arbitration law, and the kind of talent pool available at the other end to push through actual disputes to closure. And that's where we need to make India as a completely world-class service center for the world.
You know, there are several legal forums where there is no quorum. The bench is not complete. In certain cases, you don't even have the chairpersons.
Yeah. I mean,
so that's a huge practical difficulty. And now there are more forums where, in fact, recruitment could be a problem, right? That's what you're looking at.
That's one. What I was trying to also address is the domain knowledge with people who are trying to resolve the disputes.
That's right.
So you have transactions where the domain knowledge is sitting somewhere in New York or somewhere in Brussels, but cannot walk across the line because of regulatory restrictions. And that's something we need to break. That's one. The other side is our own entrepreneurs who are going global. I mean, you have the Digital India, Make in India, and you're trying to see a surge, $5 trillion GDP in 5 to 6 years, 7 to 8% GDP existing. So we have a roadmap we are moving on.
I'll leave the last word to you. Closing comments. How do you think the government can walk the talk? Any aspects that you would like to highlight?
I think the reforms of the last 2 years are really impressive, and we're seeing it as experts, but also our clients see it. And they start getting confidence again in India, which was a problem in the last 5 to 10 years, say. And we're seeing an increased investment again. What needs to be done now is implementation. So the government must prove that it can implement things. And as I said before, if only 50% of the reforms are implemented, I think India will be at a completely different level economically as compared to today.
So clearly implementation being the key word. It is a proactive government. It's done a lot in terms of creating a more facilitative atmosphere, not only for the companies based out of India, but also for MNCs. But going ahead, of course, implementation and perhaps some more thinking on simplifying some of the existing laws and regulations. I think that would be music to the ears of not only the global investor community, but also India Inc. On that note, we've completely run out of time. Thank you so much for tuning in. This is Ashwin Mohan signing off.